Hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about Mark Rosewater's Blue and Green Berserk deck from 1994. The very special thing about this deck is that I just copied it. I decided to recreate the historic deck that Mark Rosewater was talking about in his article. I'm going to give you a link. So there is no sideboard because he doesn't recall what the sideboard was. There are some restrictions that seem a bit weird by modern old school standards. For instance, there is only one Berserk, which is definitely suboptimal for this deck, but I didn't modify it. There are also some other choices that wouldn't perhaps be optimal by modern standards, but I must once again emphasize that this is exactly the same deck from 1994 with no modifications. And in 1994 many people still were not aware how mana curve works, and there were some interesting choices. People were still playing with what they had, many of them, and had no idea of most basic concepts that we definitely understand nowadays. So this is why this deck is really good for its time, and it does even stand the test of time. Of course it can be modified and improved and made a little bit better and competitive, but I even did manage to play using this deck with some more or less competitive decks. And the first thing that is great about this deck is that it's incredibly fun to play. It's very fast, it's very powerful, it's explosive. And if you win, you really have fun. If you lose, you still have fun. This is the best thing. Opponents like to play against this deck typically. It's a fair deck, it's powerful and fast, but still both players really get to have fun when you have this deck, typically. So the first thing about this deck is that you've got 4 tropical islands. This is the only modification I made. I do not have 4 drops, I only have 2 of them, so I've got 2 copies of City of Brass. It doesn't really change anything. Other than that, every single card that you find in the list is there. So for mana base we also have 6 forests. And a little bit less islands, because we want to have Birds of Paradise or Llanowar Elves early, or even Concordant Crossroads. We also have 4 Mishras, which makes sense. We've got all the mana acceleration we can use. So obviously there is a Lotus, the 2 Moxies in the right colors. There is also 1 Pendle Heaven, and I might be wrong, but I believe that back in those days they were still using the legendary rule from the very original printing of Legends, where you could only have 1 legendary permanent of the same name in your deck, so they were restricted. I believe that this was the case, because personally I would probably have 1 extra copy of Pendle Heaven in this deck. Maybe that's not the case, maybe it's by design of the deck. Anyway, this is not really relevant. There's also a Sol Ring, which might be a little bit questionable, because when you look at the whole deck, you'll understand that there are not so many cases where we can use Sol Ring. There are of course 4 birds. We definitely need them very early, because this deck can start swinging turn 1 if we get lucky, if we get some mana acceleration. And there are also 4 elves, and I think this is one of the few decks where having both Birds of Paradise and 4 Llanowar Elves can be justifiable. They can also be nice attackers, again with Concordant Crossroads. You've got 4 Script Sprites and 4 Flying Men, which are exactly the same, but as we know, Flying Men are so much cooler because of the art, because of the nice combination of the frame and the sky. And it's always interesting, if we look back at that, I think we should actually talk about this in more detail. If we look at the creatures we've got here, look, all of the creatures right here. You've got Llanowar Elves, you've got Sprites, you've got Flying Man in plural, Pixies in plural, Archers in plural, and even I believe Birds of Paradise, yes, also in plural. So this is an interesting idea. If you look at these cards, there is no consistency, because for Script Sprites you will definitely see a couple of sprites there. For Pixies, I believe you see 3 creatures here, or maybe even more. But let's say for Archers and for Flying Men you see only 1 creature that represents this so to say, army of creatures. My personal idea is that originally creatures meant to represent not just one creature, but maybe an army, a small group of these creatures, which would be very similar to some tactical games such as Heroes of Might and Magic, where you would get one creature, but in reality it represents an army of creatures. So this might be a good explanation, also to some inconsistency, but of course we shouldn't get into that really deeply, because this would mean that we would overanalyze it and there would be many things that do not make sense. You know, the famous 13 squirrels can kill Emrakul or something like that. It doesn't really matter. So yes, these, as I wanted to say, are incredibly important. They have flying, so very often your opponent will not be able to block them at all. Turn 1, turn 2. I believe that these are the main cards here. We also have 2 pixies. Pixies are of course very good against Mishras, which are ubiquitous. Elvish archers, only 2 copies as well. If I could, I would modify this deck to add more archers. And now let's see what we actually use to pump these creatures. We have 4 Giant Growth. We've got 4 Unstable Mutation. Unstable Mutation is such a great card. It is so annoying. Of course it does kill your creature eventually, but before that it gives you 6 extra damage that you can usually deal. A really great card. And of course there are some combos with it. There are some interesting combinations with bouncing and such, which we don't have in this deck, but still a great card. To be honest, this was the first time I got to play this card, even though I had known about it for 23 years, I believe. A very good card, definitely. Concordant Crossroads is an interesting main deck choice in this particular build. I believe that the idea was to get your creatures out as early as possible, to get, let's say, turn 1 Lotus, Concordant Crossroads, Elves, Sprites, Flying Man, maybe some Moxen, and get as much damage as you can turn 1, and then maybe get a Time Walk. Of course it is always questionable, because this card is symmetrical. It will definitely work for your opponents very often. But in my experience, I believe that in the majority of matchups, we could definitely profit off this card more than our opponent can. And especially with flyers that have some evasion, and maybe with some extra enchantments and pump spells, we can definitely deal more damage with that. And a bonus is that this is an enchant world, as you remember, so it can kill the Abyss, and even Mark Rosewater himself said about this, that this was the rationale for including 4 copies of this card. And you know, it combos nicely with Birds of Paradise with these, which I believe is the real Birds of Paradise, or at least a bird that really looks similar to the real world, so to say, Bird of Paradise. Anyway, so yes, killing the Abyss, Nether Void, and some other important enchant worlds is another point we've got here. Finally, we've got Berserk. Berserk, as you definitely remember, this is one of the cards that was originally restricted. So this is why you only have 1 copy. Of course, if you want to build a similar deck like this, and you don't have this restriction, definitely go for 4 copies of Berserk and remove something else. No questions asked here, of course. We try to compensate the only copy of Berserk by having 2 recursion spells, 1 regrowth and also 1 recall, which is a bit unusual for some smaller and faster decks. Typically they might feature regrowth but not the recall card. But I believe it is still a good and reasonable choice. Of course we've got Ancestral and 1 Time Walk. As I often say, I'm not a fan of Time Walk in some very small decks with small and fast creatures that can be easily killed, because this card doesn't give you any board advantage very often. So it can be just a cantrip card, meaning that you will get to maybe untap your lands and you will be able to draw an extra card, but will not be able to deal damage if your opponent has powerful blockers. But I believe that in this deck it worked quite well. So this is the deck that we've got. Once again, had a lot of fun playing it. What would you do if you could actually upgrade this deck? Definitely Concordant Crossroads would go to sideboard. We will have 4 copies of Berserk. We'll also have 1 copy of Time Twister. I'm not sure why Time Twister was not included here, because we've got all other pieces of power, which are the standard cards here. I haven't read about it. I'm not sure what the deck builder thought here, but I believe there was some rationale for not including Time Twister, but it will definitely make the deck more explosive. Maybe I would remove Land of War Elves or Birds of Paradise, not sure, and add some more creatures with 2 power. But other than that, it is still a great deck. It is, as I have said many times, fun to play, and I want to emphasize it because this is really probably one of the most interesting and feel-good decks that I have held in my hands. And it is also very interesting to revisit old decks, to read some old articles. And if you're interested in that, we will definitely have this discussion in the future. We will definitely talk about some archives and some very important articles that are buried very deep in the archives of wizards.com. They still exist, but you certainly will not find them if you just go to the website of Wizards. They're removed from the archive page. And what I mean by that is that if you go to the article archive, or just want to look through the column of one particular writer, it will be buried very deeply. It will be buried very, very far away, and you will have to scroll for a long time, or sometimes will not find it at all. But if you just use Google search, if you use a custom search and just write site wizards.com and then some particular term, you will find a lot of interesting things. For instance, an interview with Mark Teedin. You will find a description of Arabian Nights flavor. You will find an interesting deck list, or maybe several interesting deck lists of those days, or card history. So this is certainly something to explore. While it is still there, while it is still online, we understand that the internet unfortunately turned out not to be a very good place for information conservation, and to be honest, it is a bit surprising, but I digress. I still wanted to say that this is a great deck to play. If you have a chance, build something like this. Blue-green Berserk. Maybe have any ideas on how to improve this deck. Some people can throw in Serendipity, of course, and it does make sense to do that. Thank you for watching. I will be revisiting this idea, maybe upgrading this particular build, or maybe I will be revisiting the idea of building historic decks from the past events. This is definitely fun, and I believe that this is what Old School is about. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon with more deck tech videos and other 93 and 94 stuff. Bye.